Exactly 250 years ago, in the spring of 1775, Nicholas Creswell was traveling from the area right around Pittsburgh, down the Ohio, up the Kentucky River, into the interior of Kentucky. Now, this trip sounds easy today, but in the time period, 250 years ago, he was inexperienced. He was in his early 20s. He was traveling with unknown and untrustworthy traveling companions. He was in a rickety little dugout canoe. He was traveling with hostile Native Americans, very few provisions, and the equipment he had was rudimentary at best. This was obviously a dangerous but exciting trip for him. And the provisions are what we want to kind of lock into today. How were they eating? What were they doing? A couple of weeks ago, I talked about catching fish being an important part of surviving. And another part of survival here is the fact that they had to hunt along the way, and then they had to figure out how to preserve their food for short periods of time. It can be easy enough to hunt in that situation in that there was lots of game, but a lot of that game was huge. So they were hunting bison a lot of the time. And when you down a bison, you have, 800 pounds of meat. What are you going to do with that? You have to continue to travel. You, of course, can eat fresh meat for a day or two, but what happens if you need that food for a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later? And that's the challenge that they had, especially with the deer and the bison meat. So they went through great stretches of time when there was nothing to get, no deer, no bison, and so they had to carry along some of their provisions. They need to figure out how to preserve their meat so that they'll have food 3 days later, 5 days later, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. And they're using a method called jerking meat. Now today, of course, we would call it jerky, and it is just simply smoking and drying the bison or the venison over a fire. For Nicholas Creswell, this was a strange method of preservation. He hadn't really dealt with it before, so he describes it. And this is May 18th, 1775. All hands employed in curing our buffalo meat, which is done in a particular manner. The meat is first cut from the bones in thin slices like beef steaks. Then 4 forked sticks are stuck in the ground in a square form, and small sticks laid on these forks in the form of a gridiron about 3 feet from the ground. The meat is laid on this and a slow fire is put under it, turned until it is done. This is called jerking the meat. I believe it is an Indian method of preservation. It answers very well where salt is not to be had and will keep a long time if it is secured from the wet. The lean parts eat very dry. The buffalo flesh differs a little from beef, only rancor in taste. So here he's describing this entire process where we basically butcher up the buffalo. We have particular kinds of cuts we're probably looking for. Some they probably eat particularly fresh, and others are better for this curing method. Now, they have more or less success in this curing method. He says here that if it's kept from the wet, it will last a very long time. Now, this is the starting process for pemmican. This is exactly what happens with pemmican out on the Great Plains. They would have all these buffalo and they would turn it into all this dried meat. Then they would pound up the dried meat and they would mix it with the organ fats and turn it into pemmican, which can last for years and years. Now, this dried meat, though, he says you have to protect it from wet. Now, how are they doing that? Here they are, they're in canoes, they're going down the river, they don't have plastic, they probably don't have waxed things. It is very difficult to keep this from getting wet and from going bad. And much later on in his travels here, he talks about the little bit of dried beef that they have is all full of maggots because either they didn't have the time to dry it all the way or it got wet on their travels. The method here does change a little bit from time to time. On June 11, 1775, he talks about killing a buffalo cow, butchering it, and then camping and then curing the meat. And he says, sprinkled it with salt, which makes it more palatable. So at times when they do have salt, even though he mentioned earlier on, it works well when you don't have salt, it'll make better tasting and probably quicker curing if we can add a little bit of salt to the meat. They're trying to quickly travel from one place to another. They don't always have time to take care of their provisions, but you know, if you don't know what you're going to find when you get to your final location, it might be a bad thing if you don't take the time to work with your provisions. Here on May 28, 1775, proceeded up the river, saw a great many buffalo cross the river. All hands went ashore to surround them. Some of the rest shot a cow and a calf. Our stupid company will not stay to jerk any of the meat, though we are in want of provisions. So he knows, and they all know, that they are lacking enough food to do this trip. This is a time-consuming process, and most of the men here, the stupid company, did not want to stay and spend all day preserving the meat, and because probably they thought where they were going there would be plenty of provisions. Of course, they find out when they get there that there's no flour, there's no cornmeal, there's no extra food, so they're really out of luck. I already have a fire pit here with some warm coals and some forked stakes I put in the ground. I don't have these 3 feet off the ground. They're a little bit lower than that. I'm just gonna build a grid up on top of this. I've got some nice straight sticks that I've cut here in the woods. Whenever you're in a deep woods section like this, you can usually go out to the edges where there are lots of straight rod sticks that we can cut to make our grid. Doesn't take very long at all. We can cut this beef a lot of different ways, but what we want are long, thin pieces that are across the grain. So I've got a particular kind of round cut here that I can cut across the grain in very large sections and cut it into strips so that it's easy to eat. If we cut this along the grain and have strips that really hold together well, that's the problem. When they're dried, they'll be like rope and they'll be very, very difficult to eat. The process here is all about drying. We don't want to cook the meat. That's why we have it this far off of the fire. In fact, this might be a little too close to the fire. Might cook it more than we want it. We're trying to just drive all the moisture out. Now we have the smoky fire going on here to keep insects away from the meat. We don't want any of that kind of contamination to it, and that's the reason why they would have that. So we could do it with the sun. If we had a very low humidity day, that would work. If you don't, then you really have to use the smoke and a little bit of heat from the fire to drive the moisture off. We would like this because it adds smoky flavor to it, but smoky flavor was not desirable in the 18th century because almost everything they cooked was over a wood fire, and of course, everything had that smoky flavor, so it was undesirable in the time period. But when it comes to preserving, well, we're going to smoke it if possible. Now we can leave this over the smoke basically all day long, and the more it gets a chance to dry, the better. Obviously they had to kind of stop and leave at some point, and possibly theirs wasn't dry enough, so they had problems with it going bad. Here's some that I've done previously. This is very, very dried. So we can do this in a modern sense. It's much easier than doing it like this with a modern dehydrator, especially one that you can set at an extremely low temperature or no temperature at all. If it just pulls the air through and dries it out, then that's the best case scenario. Or if you've got a modern one, you could set down to say 105 degrees. That'll work too. And you can set this to dry for maybe 24 hours and you will get to something like this. Now, we see modern jerky today and it's red. And the reason why it's red is because it's got nitrates in it. You put sodium nitrate or nitrite, and that keeps the red color and it makes it softer. But that's not what their dried meat was like in the time period. It would look very dark brown, maybe even sort of blackish. And you know, it eats differently than modern jerky, which has other kinds of salts and maybe kind of flavoring to it. If our provisions included some, say, ship's biscuit or possibly just some flour or cornmeal, you could make a sort of a stew or soup by taking your dried beef, breaking it up, and eating it that way. But even just like this, it's very palatable. It isn't probably the best thing you've ever eaten in your life because it's so simple. It's just basically dried beef. but it will keep a very long time if it was kept dry. This was even something that they sold as a provision, like pemmican. They would produce just this dried meat and sell it to traders and explorers. So here's a little piece. We're gonna try this out and find out what it tastes like. See, it breaks off fairly easily because it's cut across the grain. It's not terribly salty. This batch, I didn't put very much salt on, or I don't think I put any salt on it at all. So it's got the natural saltiness of the beef. It's got some beef flavor to it, but there's no other complicating flavors, which is probably good in this circumstance. We don't want to have this really strong flavored thing that we have to survive on over and over and over again. If this was our only provision, we want to have it be a little plain. And it's got great beefy flavor, and if we wanted to have that other kind of dish where we turned it into a soup or a stew, it would work really well for that. It is something that they survived on, and we could probably survive on it today.